Thank you, everybody, for coming to the Aaron Torres Podcast YouTube page. If you could do me a quick favor, see that little subscribe button at the bottom of your screen? Go ahead, click that subscribe button. Really does help our channel grow, our audience grow, and I really do appreciate it more than you know. So click that subscribe button. Appreciate your support. Now, here's the video that you came here for. We got news on Monday afternoon into Tuesday about the future of the ACC. Remember, Florida State, Clemson have been desperately trying to get out of the ACC for about 2.5 years by now. I have told you for years, I have not seen the scenario where it's going to happen. Well, I bring it up because on Tuesday, Clemson and Florida State, who are both suing the ACC, have dropped their lawsuits and are now with the conference. You know, they say through the end of their TV contract in 2036, probably, though, realistically, they are in this conference until 2030. And I'll say this, conference realignment, it appears as though it is going to hit a back burner here now for at least 5 years. By the way, can't we all be grateful for that? Okay. So let's go back to the ACC and Clemson, the ACC, Florida State and Clemson. Okay. I think you can go back to many years ago, long before we had producer Matt, long before this was a video podcast, okay? I remember the day that Texas and Oklahoma announced they were leaving for the SEC, or even not even they announced. The report came out at SEC Media Days. It was, July of 2021. My buddy Mark Ryan, who at the time hosted radio in South Carolina covering Clemson, he put out a tweet that said, Florida State and Clemson have engaged the SEC about potentially joining the league. And all the big J journalists, oh, who's this local guy? He doesn't know what he's talking about, this and that. And I said, one, I trust Mark more than I trust some reporter that's 2,000 miles away. But two, what I said was, of course, Clemson and Florida State engaged the SEC. It doesn't mean that the SEC called back. It doesn't mean that they offered them a spot. It doesn't mean that they're impending members. But you go back 4 or 5 years, I said, listen, Clemson and Florida State are going to try to get out because as we saw 4 or 5 years ago, and as we certainly see now, if you're not in the SEC and if you're not in the Big Ten, then you're always going to be chasing and trying to get into one of those two leagues. Those two leagues have better TV contracts, better revenue, and that revenue is significant at a place like Florida State and Clemson. Florida State and Clemson see themselves as the equals of Florida, of South Carolina, of the SEC, of the Big Ten. Clemson's won a national championship. Florida State's won a national championship more than basically all but 5, 6 schools. I mean, Florida State won a championship a decade ago, so it's not like they've been, terrible forever. By the way, they were 14-0, 13-0 last year and won the ACC 2 seasons ago. And so I just bring it up because they've always seen those schools as their equals, and we've always talked about how bad this ACC TV deal is. We've talked about the fact that really, as the ACC and the Big Ten, or the SEC and the Big Ten are pulling away, those schools are going to be making $50, $60, $70, maybe $80 million a year by the end of their TV deals. The ACC is like $30 million behind. I think 40, 45 million a year in terms of what they're creating in terms of revenue. And so if you're Clemson and Florida State and you're sitting there saying, I'm trying to compete with Florida, I'm trying to compete with Georgia, I'm trying to compete with Auburn, I'm trying to compete with Alabama, I'm trying to compete with whoever, you're $30 million behind every single year. So Auburn has 30 million more than Florida State this year, but then they also have 30 million more next year and the year after and the year after. And eventually you just get into a hole too big to dig yourself out of. Okay. We've talked about this consistently. It's not just NIL. It's not just this. It's not just that. It's the ability for Olympic sports to compete. It's the ability for certainly NIL, but it's the ability to keep good assistant coaches. It's the ability to keep coordinators. It's the ability to have these front offices now that every college football team and college basketball team has. And so Florida State and Clemson were freaking out, saying, we got to figure out a way to make more money. And that is why they were suing to get out of the ACC. And so if you go back to what we've talked about, I've said it from the beginning. I said, I never thought it was going to happen. And it was really for 2 reasons. Okay. And by the way, I don't blame them because they're the 2 biggest football brands. I get it, whatever. By the way, there's other schools. North Carolina was quietly trying to get out, whatever. But I said there's really 2 reasons, in my opinion, that it is not going to happen. One, they're not going to be able to get out of the TV deal. And this is where Aaron was right, because I said for years, all I heard was, oh my goodness, well, all these great lawyers, Clemson's going to hire lawyers, and Florida State's going to hire lawyers, and Miami's going to hire lawyers, and North Carolina's going to hire lawyers. And when they hire these great lawyers, they're going to figure out a way to get out of this TV deal. They call it the grant of rights, which basically locks in your TV deal. And I kept saying, well, wait a second now. Clemson may have good lawyers. North Carolina may have good lawyers. You know who else had good lawyers? The ACC, when the original contract was put together. The ACC specifically wrote the contract so none of these schools could get out of it. And so to me, it never made sense that they would just figure out some loophole to get out. And then beyond that, here's the other thing. I never thought that Florida State and Clemson had a great landing spot. I don't believe the SEC really wants them. The SEC has a Florida presence in Florida. They have a South Carolina presence in South Carolina. You know Florida doesn't want them. You know South Carolina doesn't want them. And I'm sorry, this isn't the same as Texas and Oklahoma. Texas is one of the biggest brands in all of college football. It's just a different deal from all perspectives, revenue, this, that, the other thing, than Florida State and Clemson. And so I never believed the SEC wanted them. By the way, never really believed that they were a fit for the Big Ten. You know, the Big Ten likes to get high and mighty with their academics. Always thought North Carolina, maybe a Virginia, maybe a Duke was a better fit for the Big Ten. Probably North Carolina and Virginia. But so I bring it up because I never saw this scenario where there was a great landing spot for Clemson and Florida State. And so I never believed they were leaving, and they have finally come to a resolution and figured it out. Now, there are two very important things as to why this resolution came about, why now, and what it means going forward. Why it happened now, besides the fact that Clemson and Florida State have nowhere to go, I don't believe, is that they have finally come to an understanding on how the revenue will be distributed, okay? And I know this is kind of boring legalese, but I think it is important, okay? Florida State and Clemson have basically argued like, look, if you want us to stay, we have to figure out a better revenue share plan because we're the one creating all the revenue for this league, okay? And I remember, again, we've talked about this story for 4 or 5 years now. I remember Florida State, like 3 years ago, did some study about basically like the number of consumers that watch ACC football. And like Florida State, basically like, you know, I forget what the number was, but it was like 40% of all ACC viewers are watching Florida State games. I don't remember how it was tabulated, and it obviously included Clemson games, and Florida State plays Notre Dame, and they play Miami, you know, whoever. But Florida State was like, wait a second, we're creating like 30, 40% of the revenue. Why are we getting the same share as Boston College and Pitt and whatever? And so I never saw the scenario. So I always defended Florida State because I said, I kind of get it, right? If you're creating all the revenue, why do I have to split it evenly? Well, this new contract now distributes it unevenly. That's the important part. The schools that make the college football playoff will get a bigger cut than the schools that don't. Boston College doesn't just get to ride the coattails of Clemson and get a big check because Clemson's taking football seriously and they're not. TV ratings matter. We don't have all the specifics, but basically the teams that bring in more eyeballs are going to get more money. You know who those schools are. It's Florida State, it's Clemson, it's maybe Miami, it's maybe North Carolina. So that's the good news. And then the other thing that I think is worth noting, and this is actually very important. This is the part that to me is actually very important, is that the grant of rights, which allows them to get out of the not the grant of rights, the buyout to get out of the contract, it goes down significantly in 2030. Now, why is that noteworthy? It is because the current Big Ten TV deal expires in 2030. And so basically, it feels as though it's a compromise for the ACC, like, hey, let's just get through these next 5 years and let's see where we don't know where college sports has changed so much in the last year, the last 2 years, the last 5 years. We don't know where we're going to be in 2030. Think about college sports in 2020 compared to 2025. No NIL, no transfer portal. This was all obviously before the pandemic, but like you think about how different college sports is now from 5 years. Where's it going to be 5 years from now? And so basically the ACC is like, look, if you want to, in 5 years, if you have an opportunity to leave, you can reconsider. You'll pay us a lot of money, but whatever. But at least it's not through 2036 when that TV deal ends. So to me, this is a very important moment. I don't think there's going to be any moving and shaking in the ACC between now and 2030. But I believe 2030, that's when you could see some chaos. When that Big Ten TV deal ends, could they want North Carolina? Could they want Virginia? Again, is Duke a factor? Is Miami football a factor? I don't know, but it feels like at least for now, we've got some resolution. And yeah, this was one that I told you pretty much all along was going to be the way that it is. So I guess credit to Torres for ending up being right.